When you finally go silent, something profound happens, not just in the outer dynamic, but in the inner world of the narcissist. From the outside, silence may look like nothing. No messages, no reactions, no explanations. But psychologically, silence is not empty. It is a sudden rupture in a system that depended on your emotional presence to function. The narcissist does not experience your absence as loss in the way a healthy person might. They experience it as collapse, a disruption in their sense of self, a threat to their internal stability. For someone with narcissistic traits, other people are not experienced as separate individuals with their own emotional realities. They are experienced as sources of regulation, mirrors that reflect value, power, control, and significance. Your attention, your reactions, your pain, your forgiveness, even your anger, all of it served a purpose. It kept their fragile inner world from falling into chaos. When you go silent, that supply disappears, and what is left behind is a raw exposure to the emptiness they spend their lives avoiding. This is why the first response is often shock, not sadness, not longing, but a kind of psychic vertigo. The structure they relied on to hold themselves together is suddenly gone. Imagine leaning on a wall your entire life, only to find one day that it no longer exists. You don't just fall, you realize how dependent you were on it. In that moment, the narcissist is forced, however briefly, to feel the instability that has always lived inside them. And because they were never taught how to self-soothe, how to tolerate vulnerability, or how to hold emotional pain with compassion, this internal chaos feels unbearable. They may tell themselves they don't care. They may act indifferent, dismissive, even triumphant. But these are defenses, not truths. Beneath them is a rising sense of threat. Your silence removes their ability to define themselves through you. Without your emotional response, they are no longer reflected as powerful, desirable, or superior. They are left alone with a self that feels empty, unworthy, and exposed. And this is the very state they have spent their lives running from. From a trauma-informed perspective, this collapse is not random. It is the echo of an early wound. Somewhere in their past, often in childhood, there was a failure of attunement. They did not feel truly seen, safe, or emotionally held. So they learned to construct an identity based not on authenticity, but on performance and control. They learned that connection meant power, and power meant survival. Your silence threatens this entire structure because it says, without words, you no longer get to define me. And when you are no longer defined by them, they feel undefined themselves. This is where panic begins to stir, not always visible, but deeply felt. They may start replaying interactions, questioning how they lost control, wondering what you are thinking, fearing that you have moved on. Not because they miss you as a person, but because they miss what you provided: emotional anchoring, validation, a sense of importance. Your absence becomes a psychological vacuum, and the mind rushes to fill it. Yet this shock is not an invitation for you to return. It is a revelation. It shows you how deeply your presence was tied to their sense of self, and how little space there was for your own. Your silence exposes the truth that the relationship was not built on mutual recognition, but on emotional extraction. You were not loved for who you were, but for how you made them feel about themselves. And here is the most important part. Their shock is not your responsibility. You are not required to soothe the wound you did not create. You are not obligated to return to a system that survived by draining you. Silence in this context is not cruelty, it is self-preservation. It is the first moment in which you choose your own nervous system over someone else's unresolved pain. When you understand this, the guilt begins to loosen its grip. You realize that what feels like abandonment to them is actually your return to yourself. Their shock is the sound of an old pattern breaking. Your silence is not the end of love, it is the end of illusion. After the initial shock settles, something else begins to take shape. The silence no longer feels like a sudden collapse. It starts to feel like a threat that must be managed. This is where the narcissist moves from internal disorientation into strategic response. They may not consciously think I am losing control, but their nervous system knows it. And when the nervous system perceives a threat, it does what it has always learned to do. It tries to restore the familiar, even if the familiar is dysfunctional. At this stage, the narcissist begins scanning for ways to reestablish connection, not through vulnerability or accountability, but through manipulation. Silence is intolerable because it removes their access to emotional regulation, so they attempt to reopen the channel. This might look like sudden kindness, nostalgic messages, apologies that sound sincere but lack depth. It might also appear as anger, blame, or accusations designed to provoke a reaction. What matters is not the tone, but the intent to pull you back into the emotional field, where they can once again feel significant. From a trauma-informed perspective, this is not random behavior. It is the reenactment of an old survival strategy. Many people with narcissistic patterns learned early in life that connection was unstable and conditional. They may have experienced caregivers who were emotionally unavailable, unpredictable, or critical. To survive, they learned to perform, to control, to manipulate, to charm, whatever was necessary to secure attention and reduce abandonment anxiety. Your silence activates this ancient fear, and the system responds with what it knows. They may reach out with vulnerability, speaking of pain, loneliness, or regret. And for a moment it may feel real, but look closely. True vulnerability invites mutuality and responsibility. What they offer is often a performance of vulnerability, designed to evoke your empathy and pull you back into caretaking. It is not about repair, it is about relief. They are trying to soothe their own discomfort by reestablishing your role in their emotional economy. If that doesn't work, the tone may shift. The same person who claimed to miss you may now accuse you of being cruel, selfish, or heartless. This is not contradiction. It is escalation. When one strategy fails, another emerges. The goal remains the same, to provoke an emotional response. Any response will do. Anger, sadness, defense, explanation. Because reaction means access, and access means control. What makes this stage so confusing is that it can feel personal. It can seem as if they truly care, as if they are finally waking up to what they lost. But what is being mourned is not you as a whole person. It is the role you played, the mirror you held, the regulation you provided. When you go silent, you remove the stage and the performer panics. This is also where the cycle becomes visible. You may notice patterns repeating: idealization, guilt, charm, threat, rotating like gears in a machine. Each attempt is not a step toward healing, but a step back into the old structure. And your silence is the only thing that interrupts it. That is why it is met with such resistance. From a philosophical perspective, this stage reveals something essential about the nature of control. Control is always a response to fear. When someone cannot tolerate uncertainty, they try to dominate it. When they cannot sit with emptiness, they try to fill it with another person's energy. But this is not connection. It is dependency disguised as intimacy. And dependency, when rooted in unresolved trauma, becomes a form of emotional extraction. Your silence forces them to face a truth they have avoided, that no one else can stabilize what was never built from within. And while they may try to recruit you back into the familiar dance, you are no longer required to play your part. The moment you stop responding, you step out of the cycle. You become unhooked from the emotional economy that once defined the relationship. This is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of clarity. You are not punishing them. You are choosing not to abandon yourself. Their attempts to reconnect are not evidence of love, but of discomfort with losing access to your emotional presence. And here is the quiet power of this stage. Every time you choose not to engage, you weaken the pattern. You show yourself that you can tolerate the discomfort of separation without collapsing. You begin to reclaim your autonomy, not through confrontation, but through non-participation. In that sense, your silence is not passive. It is deeply active. It is the boundary that says, I will no longer be the place where your unresolved pain seeks refuge. And in doing so, you begin to build a life that is no longer organized around someone else's fear. When you no longer respond, you are not disappearing. You are finally arriving in your own life. As the cycle continues, something subtle but profound begins to happen beneath the surface. When your silence no longer produces the response they seek, when their usual strategies stop working, the narcissist is forced into a psychological corner. This is the stage where the external drama quiets, but the internal crisis intensifies. On the outside, they may appear indifferent, even triumphant, as if they have moved on. But inside, the nervous system is unraveling a story it is dependent on for survival. For someone organized around narcissistic defenses, identity is not something that emerges from inner coherence. It is constructed through reflection. They know who they are by how they are seen. Your absence removes a critical mirror. Without you responding, reacting, or orienting around them, the feedback loop collapses. This is not merely emotional discomfort, it is an existential threat. The self they have built begins to lose definition, and with it, the sense of control that once held the world together. At this stage, they may seem to detach. They may rush into a new relationship, flood social media with images of happiness, or speak about their life as if it is suddenly perfect. But this is not healing, it is substitution. They are attempting to replace the lost mirror as quickly as possible, because the alternative is to sit with the emptiness that has always been there. What you are witnessing is not growth but flight. They are running from the same inner wound that has shaped every connection in their life. From a trauma-informed lens, this makes sense. The narcissistic structure is often built on early experiences of emotional neglect, humiliation, or inconsistent love. The child learns that being authentic is unsafe, that worth must be earned through performance, and that connection is something to manage rather than feel. Over time, these adaptations harden into personality patterns. When you go silent, you do not just remove a relationship, you destabilize the entire system that has kept their pain out of awareness. This is why the grief they experience is not straightforward. It is not simply the loss of you, it is the loss of a stabilizing illusion. They may feel restless, anxious, or numb, unable to locate the source of their distress. They may blame you, others, or the world itself, because turning inward would require facing the original wound. And that wound, once touched, threatens to dismantle the defenses that have defined them for decades. Philosophically, this moment reveals a deep truth about identity. When the self is built on external validation, it cannot survive in silence. It requires constant reinforcement, like a flame that needs fuel. Your absence deprives it of oxygen. And in that deprivation, there is the possibility of collapse, but also the possibility of transformation. The tragedy is that most never choose the second. It is easier to rebuild the illusion than to grieve its necessity. For you, this stage can be disorienting. You may hear that they are doing great, that they have moved on effortlessly, that you were easily replaced, and that story can reopen old wounds, making you question your worth or the reality of what you shared. But what you are seeing is not resolution, it is repetition. The pattern continues, only with a new face, because the root has never been addressed. What matters now is not what they do next, but what you choose to do with the space you have reclaimed. Silence creates a vacuum, and that vacuum invites you back to yourself. It asks you to notice where you once abandoned your needs, minimized your truth, or contorted yourself to maintain connection. It gives you the opportunity to build a relationship with your own inner world on that is not dependent on someone else's recognition. This is the deeper purpose of going silent. It is not to provoke regret or punishment, but to restore sovereignty, to step out of a system that required you to disappear in order for someone else to feel whole. And as you grow into that autonomy, you may begin to feel something new. Not just relief, but dignity. The dignity of no longer chasing what cannot love you back in the way you deserve. You are not responsible for the collapse of another person's defenses. You are only responsible for honoring your own truth. And when you choose silence, you are choosing a life that no longer revolves around someone else's unresolved pain. You do not need to be seen by those who cannot see themselves. Your freedom begins the moment you stop offering your soul as a mirror. When the silence stretches on and there is still no response, something even deeper begins to surface. This is the stage where the narcissist is no longer just reacting to the loss of control, but confronting the unbearable emotional reality that their entire identity has been built to avoid. What emerges is not insight at first, but collapse disguised as indifference. On the outside, they may appear calm, detached, even empowered. Inside, however, the nervous system is in a state of quiet panic. The old strategies are no longer working, and the psyche is scrambling to restore a sense of stability. At this point, many people assume the narcissist has moved on. They see new relationships, new goals, new energy, and they conclude that the silence meant nothing. But this is a misunderstanding of how trauma-based personalities function. For someone whose sense of self depends on external validation, silence is not neutral. It is destabilizing. It forces the mind into a survival response, where replacement becomes more important than reflection. They do not heal by grieving, they cope by substituting. What looks like confidence is often just the next performance in a long line of performances. From a trauma-informed perspective, this behavior is rooted in early emotional wounding. The narcissistic pattern often develops when a child learns that their authentic self is either invisible or unacceptable. Love becomes conditional, attention becomes currency, and vulnerability becomes dangerous. Over time, the nervous system adapts by building a false self, one that is impressive, controlled, and self-sufficient on the surface, but profoundly fragile underneath. When you go silent, you are not just ending a relationship, you are removing the emotional scaffolding that has supported that false self. This is where the deeper grief begins, even if it is never consciously acknowledged. The narcissist may feel a vague sense of emptiness, restlessness, or meaninglessness. They may become more impulsive, more restless, or more dependent on stimulation. This is not because they are heartbroken, in the way most people understand it, but because the inner void they have been running from is now more exposed. Without a mirror to reflect back their worth, they are forced to sit with a self that feels strangely hollow. Philosophically, this moment exposes the cost of building an identity on other people's approval. When the self is not rooted in inner truth, it becomes a fragile structure that collapses in the absence of validation. Silence, in this sense, becomes a kind of existential mirror. It reveals not only the loss of the relationship, but the absence of a stable inner world. And while this could be the beginning of genuine transformation, it is also the point where most turn away. Facing that emptiness requires humility, grief, and the courage to question everything they believe about themselves. Instead of choosing that path, many double down on distraction. They chase admiration, status, or intensity. They may speak of new partners as soulmates, or present their life as suddenly perfect. But this is not growth, it is avoidance. The pattern continues because the wound remains untouched. The silence has not changed them, but it has exposed the truth. Without constant external reinforcement, the structure cannot hold. For you, witnessing this stage can stir complex emotions. You might feel replaced, dismissed, or insignificant. It may seem as though your absence has had no impact at all, but what you are seeing is not indifference, it is compensation. The speed with which they seek something new is not a sign of strength, but of dependency. They are not moving forward, they are circling the same unresolved pain. What matters now is where you place your attention. Silence is not just a boundary, it is an invitation to return to yourself. It allows you to see how much energy you once spent managing someone else's emotions, interpreting their moods, or shrinking your own needs to preserve the connection. In the quiet, you can begin to feel the parts of yourself that were ignored, suppressed, or abandoned. This is the true shift. While they struggle to rebuild the old illusion, you are given the chance to build something real, a relationship with yourself that is grounded in honesty, self-compassion, and presence. You are no longer required to perform, prove, or disappear to be accepted. And in that space, something profound happens. You begin to experience yourself not as an extension of someone else's wounds, but as a whole person in your own right. Silence, then, is not the end. It is the beginning of a deeper kind of freedom. You are not losing them, you are finding yourself. As the cycle continues, there comes a stage that is quieter, more deceptive, and often more confusing than the dramatic attempts to pull you back in. This is the phase where the narcissist appears to let go. There are no messages, no visible rage, no obvious games. From the outside, it can look like acceptance, maturity, even growth. But what is really happening beneath the surface is not peace. It is strategic emotional withdrawal mixed with unresolved grief and deep resentment. This stage is not about closure. It is about internal reorganization around the wound of rejection. When a narcissist can no longer extract emotional energy from you, the psyche does something very specific. It reframes the story. Instead of feeling abandoned or powerless, The mind constructs a narrative where they are the one who chose to leave, who rose above, who no longer cares. This is not conscious lying, it is psychological self-protection. The ego cannot tolerate the experience of being unwanted or irrelevant, so it reshapes reality to preserve a sense of superiority. What you see as moving on is often just the final layer of denial. From a trauma-informed perspective, this is the nervous system returning to a freeze state. The earlier phases, hoovering, rage, obsession, are forms of hyperarousal. They are attempts to restore control and regulate distress through external engagement. When those fail, the system collapses inward. The narcissist may become emotionally flat, detached, or strangely cold. They tell themselves they are free, unbothered, healed. But inside, the original wound of abandonment is still very much alive. It is simply buried deeper, where it can no longer be felt without threatening the entire identity structure. This internal shutdown often comes with a subtle shift in values, where once you were idealized, now you may be quietly devalued in their inner narrative. They replay the relationship not to understand it, but to justify its end. Your boundaries become proof that you were difficult. Your silence becomes evidence that you were cold. This reinterpretation is not meant to harm you. It is meant to protect them from the unbearable truth that they were unable to sustain a real, mutual connection. In this way, emotional distancing becomes a defense against shame. Philosophically, this stage reveals how fragile the false self truly is. It cannot grieve because grief requires vulnerability. It cannot apologize because that would mean accepting responsibility. So instead of integration, there is emotional amputation. Parts of the past are cut off, denied, or minimized so the person can continue functioning without collapse. This is not resilience, it is survival. The cost, however, is the loss of authenticity. Each time a relationship is erased rather than processed, the inner world becomes more disconnected, more hollow. For you, this phase can feel like erasure. You may wonder if the relationship ever mattered, if you were ever truly seen. The silence can feel colder than the conflict, because there is no longer any acknowledgement of the emotional reality you shared. But this, too, is part of the pattern. The narcissist is not capable of holding complexity, the truth that they can both care and fail, love and harm, so they choose the simpler story that it meant nothing or that you were the problem. This is where your own healing deepens. Instead of chasing understanding from someone who cannot offer it, you begin to generate meaning from within. You recognize that their emotional withdrawal is not a verdict on your worth, but a reflection of their limits. You start to feel the grief they cannot feel, the sadness they cannot face, the honesty they cannot hold. And in doing so, you break the cycle at its core. The power of this stage lies in what it offers you, a final release from the illusion that their healing is your responsibility. You no longer need them to validate your experience, to acknowledge the pain, or to make sense of what happened. You carry the truth now, and you can hold it with compassion rather than self-blame. And that is the real turning point. When you stop trying to be understood by someone who cannot see you, you begin to understand yourself. Freedom begins when you no longer wait for someone else to feel what they have spent a lifetime avoiding. As the cycle reaches its final psychological phase, something subtle but profound happens, not in the narcissist, but in you. By now, the external drama has largely faded. The messages have stopped, the emotional storms have passed, and the silence has settled into something steady. What remains is not the person who hurt you, but the imprint they left on your nervous system. This last stage is not about what the narcissist does anymore. It is about what you reclaim. From a trauma-informed perspective, long exposure to a narcissistic relationship conditions the body and mind to live in a state of anticipation. You learn to scan for mood shifts, to predict reactions, to brace yourself emotionally. Even after the relationship ends, your nervous system may still act as if danger is nearby. A sound, a memory, a phrase can trigger the same stress response you felt before. This is not weakness, it is adaptation. Your body was trying to keep you safe in an unsafe emotional environment. Healing, then, is not simply letting go. It is retraining the nervous system to recognize that the threat has passed. It is learning, slowly and patiently, to live without constant vigilance. You begin to notice how often you tense your shoulders, how quickly you explain yourself, how easily you doubt your own feelings. These are not character flaws. They are survival strategies that once made sense. Now you are invited to thank them and gently release them. There is also a philosophical shift that happens here. You realize that what you were seeking from the narcissist, validation, safety, belonging, was never truly available from them. Yet the longing itself was real. It came from a deep human need to be seen and accepted. When that need was attached to someone incapable of meeting it, the pain felt endless. In this stage, you begin to separate the need from the person. You see that the hunger for connection is not a weakness, it is a sign of your humanity. This is where self-compassion becomes essential. Many people leave narcissistic relationships carrying shame, shame for staying, for believing, for hoping. But shame keeps the trauma alive. It tells you that the pain was your fault, that you should have known better. In truth, you were responding to what every human responds to: attention, affection, the promise of love. You did not fail. You were wounded, and you tried to heal through connection. As you reclaim your inner world, something remarkable happens. You begin to experience space. Space to pause before reacting. Space to feel without judgment. Space to choose differently. This is not the dramatic freedom of anger or revenge. It is the quiet freedom of no longer being controlled by another person's emotional gravity. You no longer define yourself through their eyes. You start to feel your own rhythm again. There is also grief here, not just for the relationship, but for the version of yourself that endured it. You may mourn the years spent doubting yourself, the moments you silenced your truth, the love you gave that was never fully received. Allow that grief. It is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign that your heart is reopening. Where there is grief, there is also the possibility of renewal. This stage is where boundaries become internal, not just external. You no longer need to prove, explain, or defend yourself. You trust your emotional signals. You honor discomfort as information, not something to override. Slowly, your sense of self becomes rooted not in how others respond to you, but in how you respond to yourself. This is the deepest form of independence. From a broader perspective, this is how cycles end, not through confrontation, but through consciousness. When you understand the patterns that shaped you, they lose their power. You are no longer living in reaction to the past. You are living in relationship with the present. And in that presence, you discover a truth that no narcissist can take from you. Your worth was never something they could give or withhold. The final stage is not closure with them. It is reunion with yourself. You do know. Heal by forgetting what happened. You heal by becoming someone who no longer has to live inside it.